Deep in museum storage beneath Baghdad, a broken cuneiform fragment holds a line that feels almost too direct to be real. The clay is brittle. The edges are rough where the tablet broke thousands of years ago. Time has done what time always does. It has chipped, worn, and softened what human hands once pressed into wet earth. And still the signs remain clear enough to be read. The translation is simple, almost unsettlingly simple. When the Anunnaki made war upon the Anunnaki, not when the gods battled monsters, not when heaven fought chaos, not when order triumphed over darkness, when the Anunnaki made war upon the Anunnaki. The phrase survives in catalogs and scholarly descriptions with a tone so plain, so administrative, that it almost feels stranger than poetry would have felt. It sits there without flourish, without warning, without commentary, as though the scribe who pressed it into clay believed he was recording something procedural, something factual, something that belonged in the archive beside inventories, temple accounts, and legal disputes. And maybe that is where the unease begins, because this is not a story about mythology in the way we usually use that word. Not exactly. This is something narrower and in some ways more difficult. Across tablets excavated from the ruins of ancient Sumerian cities, and now scattered between Baghdad, London, Paris, Philadelphia, Oxford, and Chicago, there survives what appears to be a connected account of conflict. Not merely symbolic conflict, not only cosmic allegory, but struggles with named participants, contested objects, territories, hierarchies, councils, and consequences. If you're listening from somewhere quiet tonight, maybe late in the evening, maybe just before sleep, you can almost feel how far those words have traveled. From wet clay to kiln heat, from buried ruin to excavation trench, from museum drawer to translation desk, from translation into your own room, wherever you are now. If you'd like, leave a quiet note below about where you're listening from and what time it is, where you are. There is something fitting in that. Ancient words crossing distance once again. The more one reads these tablets, the more a strange pattern begins to emerge. The Weld Blundell Prism in the Ashmolean Museum. The Eridu Genesis tablet in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. Fragments of the Epic of Anzu in the British Museum. Copies of Inanna and Ibi in Chicago. The Enuma Elish preserved in later Akkadian versions. City laments from Nippur. Different centuries, different cities, different hands. And yet they speak to each other. They cross-reference. They assume continuity. They return to the same names, the same objects, the same tensions, the same fractures in power. The Sumerians used the same careful procedural style to record these matters that they used when listing grain allotments or boundary disputes. That is part of what makes the material resist easy dismissal. Because mythology usually signals itself. It leans toward image, toward grandeur, toward moral shape. These texts sometimes do that, but again and again they do something else. They preserve detail with a bureaucratic steadiness that feels less like invention and more like documentation. Consider the Tablet of Destinies. It appears in multiple compositions across centuries, not as a vague symbol, but as a specific object. Someone holds it, someone steals it, someone recovers it. Its location matters. Its custody matters. Its transfer changes the structure of power. Or consider Ninurta, the warrior figure, associated across texts with separate campaigns, separate victories, separate crises, yet always as the same identifiable actor moving through a larger chronology. Or consider Inanna, whose campaigns are described not as floating metaphors, but as actions against named territories and defiant powers. Mainstream scholarship quite reasonably reads all of this as mythology, as sacred narrative, as political theology, as a way ancient societies explain the world around them, their own power structures, their floods and wars, and dynastic collapses. That interpretation has force. It has evidence behind it. And yet something remains, something in the consistency, something in the procedural tone, something in the refusal of these texts to behave like pure allegory. The question then is not simply whether the Anunnaki were real in the modern sense of that word. That question can become too blunt too quickly. The more useful question may be quieter than that. What did the scribes think they were preserving when they copied these texts generation after generation, when they cross-referenced names and events, when they maintained frameworks stretching from the world before the flood into the dynasties after it? What did they believe they were doing? Preserving theology, recording history, maintaining memory, holding on to something that sat uneasily between all three. Because the line remains, it waits there in the clay. When the Anunnaki made war upon the Anunnaki, it does not explain itself. It does not soften itself. It does not apologize for how strange it sounds to modern ears. It simply states. And once that statement is made, other things begin to gather around it. Pre-flood cities, kingship descending from heaven, councils among divine beings, arguments over whether humanity should survive, objects that confer legitimate authority, wars over succession, wars over territory, storms that destroy cities after their protective gods depart. Not one isolated tale, but a layered archive of repeated claims. There is a temptation when approaching material like this to summarize too quickly, to resolve the tension too early, to say it is only myth, or to say it is hidden history and be done with it. But the tablets do not reward that kind of haste. They ask for slower reading than that. They ask to be handled the way one handles fragile clay, patiently, carefully, without forcing them into categories too fast. So that is what we are going to do. We are going to look at what the tablets actually say, not what later speculation wants them to say, not what modern certainty prefers they say. But what is there in the text itself? The cities they name, the reigns they list, the conflicts they describe, the objects they track, the participants they return to, the outcomes they preserve. We begin where the tablets themselves begin. In the olden days, in the cities before the flood, in the world the Sumerians said existed before catastrophe swept it away, a world where kingship descended from heaven, where the Anunnaki were not distant abstractions, but present authorities, and where the order of things, however it was maintained, had not yet collapsed into open contest. Because if the line in that broken fragment is the thesis, then what comes before it is the structure that made the war meaningful. And what comes after it is the record of what happened when that structure began to fail. The Weld Blundell Prism, now in Oxford, is one of those objects that becomes stranger the longer you look at it. It is not monumental. It does not overwhelm by size. It is a clay prism inscribed on 4 sides, carrying what scholars call the Sumerian king list. A list, in other words. A document of sequence, of succession, of rule. And like so many things in Mesopotamia, it begins with a sentence whose strangeness is almost hidden by its calm. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not invented, not negotiated, not slowly assembled by human effort, descended from heaven. And then having descended, it was placed somewhere specific. In Eridu, a city, a location, a place in the world. The statement is so steady that the scale of its claim can be missed. Kingship, the principle by which order is organized among humans, did not arise from below. It came from above. Eridu itself was ancient, even by ancient standards. The Sumerians regarded it as the first city, the place where civilization began. Archaeology confirms its great age, though not, of course, in the exact terms the texts describe. Yet the tradition is consistent. Eridu comes first, and with it comes the first named ruler, Alulim, whose reign is given as 28,800 years. After him comes Alalgar, ruling 36,000 years. The numbers are enormous, too enormous by any normal human measure to be taken literally. That is where mainstream interpretation enters sensibly and says these figures must be symbolic. Perhaps dynasties rather than individuals. Perhaps numbers carrying mathematical or ritual significance. Perhaps traces of older systems of reckoning no longer understood. All of that may be true. But what matters here is the tone in which the numbers are given. The scribe does not signal metaphor. The list does not pause to explain. The reign lengths are recorded in the same neutral format as later shorter reigns. That is important, because after the flood, the same list continues, and the reign lengths contract dramatically. Gilgamesh, for example, is assigned 126 years. Extraordinary, yes, but no longer impossible in the same naked way as 28,800 years. And yet the text presents the pre-flood and post-flood rulers in the same documentary style, as though both belong to the same category of information. After Eridu, kingship moves to Bad Tabira, then to Larak, then to Sippar, then to Shuruppak. 5 cities, 8 kings, a total of 241,200 years before the flood swept over. The phrasing is almost clinical. These are the 5 cities. 8 kings ruled them. Then the flood swept over. That last sentence matters, not only because of what it says, but because of how it says it. No lament, no elevated rhetoric, no effort to dramatize catastrophe beyond the fact of its occurrence. Civilization is obliterated, and the list records the event with the same tonal restraint it uses for dynastic transfer. This happened, then this happened, then this happened. That same world appears again in the Eridu Genesis tablet housed in Philadelphia. The tablet is damaged, fragmentary, incomplete, but enough survives to show a pattern. The same cities are named. The same pre-flood world is assumed. Humanity is created. Cities are established. Kingship is set in order. Then, after a break in the text, the flood comes. Waters rise. Storm rages. The world before is destroyed. 2 different sources, 2 different forms. And yet the same framework, a structured world before the flood, with cities' rulers and divine order already in place. This alone creates an interpretive problem. Because the archaeological record, as modern scholarship reconstructs it, shows civilization emerging gradually in Mesopotamia. Villages, then larger settlements, then cities, then writing. Continuity development accumulation, not a high civilization annihilated and later rebuilt under new conditions. And yet the Sumerian texts insist across independent witnesses that something came before, that the cities of historical Sumer were not the first beginning, but a return, a restoration, a rebuilding after loss. Every culture has memories of a golden age. Every civilization tells stories in which earlier times were larger, older, nearer to the gods. That is true. But again, the Sumerian materials resist being only that. They specify names. They specify counts. They specify locations. They preserve sequence. They do not merely say, once there was a better world. They say, here were its cities. Here were its rulers. Here is how long they ruled. Then the flood swept over. And beneath that structure lies another recurring feature. The pre-flood world is not one of human autonomy. It is a world of direct divine governance. Cities are established by divine decision. Kingship descends from heaven. Humanity exists within a system the Anunnaki oversee. The relationship between humans and these powers is formal, structured, almost administrative, though the surviving fragments only partially explain it. They seem to assume their audience already knows. That assumption is revealing. Texts explain what is unfamiliar. They glide past what is common knowledge. And the Sumerian tablets glide again and again past the basic fact of divine administration, as though it required no defense and no elaboration. The Anunnaki are simply there, acting, assigning, deciding, establishing. In one passage from the Eridu Genesis, despite damage to the tablet, a striking voice emerges. Ninhursag, or a related divine figure depending on textual reconstruction, speaks of humanity almost as something remembered and neglected. Let me bethink me of my mankind all forgotten as they are. Let me bring them back. The language suggests not a first creation in the absolute sense, but a restoration, a return, a relationship interrupted and renewed. That same logic runs under much of the pre-flood material. Humanity is not described as inventing civilization for itself. Humanity enters a world already ordered, already assigned, already governed, and then that world ends, not gradually, not through the natural erosion of institutions, through decision and catastrophe, through flood. The King List and the Genesis tradition both agree on this point. Something structured, something old, something established was swept away. And after it was swept away, kingship descended from heaven again. Not for the first time, but once more. Now into a changed world. That distinction matters because it means the flood is not simply a disaster story. It is a boundary marker between two political orders. Before the flood, one kind of relationship held between humanity and the Anunnaki. After the flood, another kind begins. The same authority remains above, but the world below has been reset. And if that is so, then the question becomes unavoidable. Why was the old world ended? Who decided, who resisted, and what tensions among the Anunnaki themselves were already present before the waters rose? Because the flood in these tablets does not appear as an act of unified divine will. It appears more quietly and more disturbingly as the first great fracture in a hierarchy that was already beginning to split. The Atrahasis tradition gives the flood a motive, and in doing so, it makes the divine world look less unified than the calm formulas of the king list might lead us to believe. In the old Babylonian tablets of Atrahasis, preserved in the British Museum, the flood does not begin as moral judgment in the later sense. It does not come because humanity has become wicked in some abstract universal way. It begins as governance failure, as strain, as policy, as disagreement. Before humanity, the text says labor belonged to junior divine beings, the Agigi. They dug canals. They maintained the systems by which order was sustained. They worked, and eventually they rebelled. They burned their tools. They marched at night to Enlil's dwelling. They surrounded the place of authority and demanded release from toil. Already before humanity enters the story, conflict exists within the divine order. The response to that crisis is not annihilation, but substitution. Enki proposes a solution. A new being will be made to bear the labor. Clay will be mixed with the blood of a slain divine rebel, and from that mixture, humanity will be formed. The language is technical, practical, almost biological in its specificity. Humanity is not presented here as a poetic flourish of divine creativity. Humanity is a response to labor, unrest. That matters, because it means the human story begins inside an already unstable hierarchy. Humans are created to solve a problem among the gods. We enter the record not as the center of creation, but as a political instrument within a larger order. And for a time, the arrangement works. The labor is transferred, the earth is cultivated, temples are maintained, the divine order rests. But then humanity multiplies. Settlements grow, noise rises. The text is explicit about this in a way modern readers sometimes find almost absurd. Enlil cannot sleep. The clamor of human civilization has become intolerable to him. The uproar deprives him of rest. It is tempting to explain this away as metaphor, noise as social disorder, noise as moral corruption, noise as some symbolic excess of human expansion. Perhaps, but the text itself does not push in that direction. It keeps returning to the sound, to the sheer pressure of human presence, to the practical disturbance of divine rest. So Enlil acts, first plague, then drought, then famine. Each time humanity is reduced, each time Enki intervenes. He gives instructions that allow humans to survive by redirecting devotion and ritual toward the divine agents carrying out the punishment. In effect, the two great powers are maneuvering against each other through humanity. Enlil presses toward reduction. Enki preserves. This is not harmony. It is not a single divine will. It is a split. The flood becomes necessary to Enlil, not because lesser measures are impossible, but because lesser measures keep being undone. So he convenes the council. Oaths are taken. The divine assembly agrees that humanity will be destroyed comprehensively by deluge, and that no warning will be given. Yet even here the hierarchy does not hold. Enki swears the oath, but finds a way around it. He does not speak directly to Atrahasis. He speaks to the wall of a reed hut. The human inside overhears. The loophole is famous, but it deserves to be lingered over because it reveals the character of the conflict. Enki does not openly overthrow the council. He subverts it from within. He preserves technical obedience while defeating the policy itself. Again, not unity, not simple divinity, procedure argument, evasion strategy. Atrahasis builds the boat. The dimensions are given. The sealing materials are specified. Provisions are gathered. Animals are brought aboard. Then the flood comes, and the descriptions are striking, not only because of the destruction, but because of the reaction above. The gods are terrified by the flood. They retreat. They cower. They regret. That detail changes everything. The beings who ordered extermination are not presented as serene, omnipotent absolutes. They are frightened by the very force they unleashed. They ascend to the heaven of Anu and crowd there in fear. The birth goddess laments. The assembly watches the destruction it has authorized and recoils from it. This is not transcendent detachment. It is crisis management gone too far. Then comes another unsettling detail. When Atrahasis emerges and offers sacrifice, the gods gather around the offering like flies. They are hungry. For the duration of the catastrophe, no humans remained to feed them through ritual. Their dependence becomes visible. The relationship between humanity and the Anunnaki is not one-directional. Humans depend on divine governance, yes. But the gods, as the text presents them, also depend on human labor, human offerings, human maintenance of the sacred economy. Remove humanity, and the system breaks on both sides. Enlil discovers survivors and erupts in fury. He demands to know who violated the plan. Enki answers, and what follows is not open war, not yet, but a confrontation in council. Enki argues not only that humanity should survive, but that a better administrative solution exists. Reduce lifespan, limit fertility, introduce mortality and difficulty into reproduction. Preserve the labor force, but cap the scale of the problem. The compromise is accepted. Humanity remains, but under new constraints. The pre-flood world is gone. The post-flood world begins. And what kind of world is that? It is a world of greater distance. The Anunnaki still hold authority, but not with the same immediacy. Human kings rule cities, but under divine patronage. Temples become residences and administrative centers for the great powers assigned to each city. Nippur, the city of Enlil, becomes the religious heart of this arrangement. The tablet of destinies remains with him there, marking the center of legitimate authority. Kingship descends from heaven, again now to Kish, and the old pattern resumes in altered form. But the flood has exposed something that cannot be unseen. The Anunnaki disagree. They can be divided. They can undermine one another. They can bring the world to catastrophe, not because they are opposed by outside chaos, but because their own hierarchy is unstable. That is the framework of the post-flood world. A restored order, yes, but an order carrying fractures within it. A structure rebuilt after catastrophe, yet rebuilt around unresolved tension. Enlil still rules formally. Enki still preserves strategically. Humanity remains in between necessary and vulnerable. This is the atmosphere in which the later conflicts have to be read. Not as isolated myths dropped from nowhere, but as events unfolding inside a system already proven fragile. The flood did not solve the deeper problem. It revealed it. The world after the flood was supposed to be regulated, supervised, stabilized. And yet the tablets keep returning to a darker possibility. that what had been rebuilt after the waters receded was never truly secure at all. If the flood exposed cracks in the post-flood hierarchy, the theft of the Tablet of Destinies revealed just how fragile that hierarchy really was. The Epic of Anzu survives in later copies, many of them preserved in the British Museum, especially from the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. The versions are late, but the story is older, and what the story records is not a battle between civilization and some distant force of chaos. It is more intimate than that, more unsettling. It is a coup from within. Anzu is not introduced as an outsider, not as a primordial enemy crashing against the edges of order. He is inside the court, near Enlil, near the chamber where authority is kept. He sees the Tablet of Destinies. He understands what it is. He understands what it does. And then, contemplating its power, he decides to take it. The lines attributed to him are not vague. They are political. I shall take the divine Tablet of Destinies. I shall control the decrees of all the gods. I shall establish my throne. I shall direct all the divine powers. This is not beastly appetite. It is ambition, structured ambition, administrative ambition. The desire to seize not merely strength, but legitimacy. And the tablet matters because it appears again and again across Mesopotamian literature as the object that makes authority binding. Whoever holds it does not merely possess prestige. He possesses the mechanism by which decrees become effective. Cosmic law is not simply spoken. It is ratified, fixed, made operative. The tablet sits at the center of that process. So when Enlil sets aside his regalia during ritual purification, and Anzu seizes the tablet and flees to the mountain, the consequences are immediate. The epic says, omens were confused. Kingship's aura left the sanctuary. Silence spread. Stillness prevailed. Again, the tone is functional. The text does not revel in abstract metaphysics. It describes system failure. Without the tablet, the remaining hierarchy cannot enforce its own commands. Order has not merely been challenged. It has been interrupted at the point of execution. What had seemed supreme turns out to depend on custody. What had seemed eternal turns out to depend on a physical object in a physical place held by a particular hand. That is one of the most unsettling implications in the entire corpus. Because if the Anunnaki were limitless in inherent power, why should theft matter so much? Why should a servant with the right object become effectively unassailable? Why should cosmic order be vulnerable to removal, transport, and seizure? The council convenes in emergency. The danger is existential. Someone must go after Anzu. Someone must reach the mountain, engage him, and recover the tablet. But one by one the great figures refuse. Adad refuses. Gira refuses. Shara refuses. The reason is consistent. So long as Anzu holds the tablet, he can nullify any attack. Weapons can be commanded to fail. Forces can be reversed. Fate itself can be redirected. This is where the story becomes especially revealing. The threat is not Anzu's raw being. It is his possession. He is dangerous because he has the mechanism. Authority is procedural, not merely personal. Enki, under another name, proposes Ninurta as the answer. Ninurta, warrior champion son of Enlil, in many traditions accepts the task. He proceeds to the mountain. And then the text gives us something that appears throughout these accounts of divine warfare technical description. Ninurta's weapon, Sharur, is not a generic symbol of might. It speaks. It scouts ahead. It identifies the enemy's position and reports back. The first encounter fails. Anzu uses the tablet to command the attack to come apart at the level of its own materials. Arrow returns to reed. Bow returns to tree. Weapon is dissolved back into origin before it can complete its purpose. The image is extraordinary, but again it is presented procedurally. This happened. This was the effect. This is why the assault failed. Ninurta withdraws, reports back. Enki advises a revised tactic. Do not strike Anzu first. Strike the tablet. Sever the point of control. Break the link between bearer and authority. Only then can the rebel be defeated. The second assault follows that logic. Sharur is deployed differently. The attack goes toward the object, not merely the holder. Anzu is wounded. His wings are cut. The tablet falls. The protection ceases. Ninurta captures him. The object is returned to Enlil. Order resumes. That is the resolution. Clean, formal, conclusive. But the implications do not resolve so cleanly, because what the epic has shown cannot be unshown. Supreme authority has been revealed to rest on something transferable. The hierarchy can be overturned through theft. A subordinate insider given access and nerve can nearly seize the whole system. The gods themselves assembled in council are shown not as untouchable absolutes, but as office holders caught in a crisis of custody and enforcement. Mainstream scholarship reads this as a Chaos Kampf myth, an order against chaos narrative, and certainly those patterns are present. Yet this text is stranger than that familiar shape. Anzu is not primordial chaos. He is a court insider. The assault comes from within the institution. The event is closer to palace coup than monster battle. That matters because later texts remember it that way. Ninurta is repeatedly identified as the one who defeated Anzu, as though this were a factual element of his biography within the larger chronology. The story is not isolated. It becomes part of a remembered sequence. The Tablet of Destinies remains part of that sequence too, appearing again later in other crises, moving through the archive as a tracked object whose possession continues to determine legitimacy. So, the theft of Anzu does more than provide one dramatic episode. It establishes a principle. The post-flood divine order is vulnerable. It can be challenged from inside. Its center is not mystical in the vague sense, but materially and procedurally defined. And once that has been demonstrated, others can learn from it. Others can see that the structure governing the world is not unbreakable. Others can see that supreme authority, despite its cosmic scope, depends on control, access, and possession. Others can calculate. That is why this episode matters so much. Not only because Anzu almost succeeded, but because the attempt itself proves that success was imaginable. The hierarchy could be destabilized. The council could be thrown into panic. The mechanisms of order could be interrupted. The coup failed. The tablet returned. The official structure resumed. But the lesson remained, and the tablets copied across centuries preserve that lesson with care. Not merely that order was restored, but that order could be stolen. The flood was supposed to settle the question of humanity. It did not. It exposed it. That is worth returning to because the Atrahasis tradition does not simply narrate catastrophe. it keeps circling back to a deeper disagreement inside the divine assembly, and that disagreement becomes one of the great recurring fractures in the archive. What are humans for? What place do they hold? Are they expendable labor or necessary participants in a larger order the Anunnaki themselves cannot sustain alone? The epic is direct from the beginning. Humanity is created as a response to divine labor, unrest. The junior divine class refuses toil. A substitute must be fashioned. That substitute is humanity. Already then, humans are not created for their own sake in the narrative's plainest layer. They are made because a system needs maintenance. Canals need digging. Fields need tending. Temples need service. Offerings need to continue. The wording carries a disturbing clarity. Let man bear the toil of the gods. That line is not philosophical. It is functional. And yet once humans exist, the relationship becomes more complicated than the designers of the system seem to have expected. Humanity multiplies. Human civilization expands. Worship begins. Cities rise. Ritual economy deepens. The same beings who once needed relief now begin to depend on the creatures fashioned to provide it. This is why Enki's defense of humanity after the flood matters so much. It is not sentimental. It is systemic. Destroy humanity, he argues, in effect, and who remains to perform the work, who maintains the temples, who provides sacrifice, who sustains the relationship through which divine order operates in the world below. This is where the epic becomes very difficult to fit into simple categories of piety. Because the gods do not appear as perfectly self-sufficient. They need human action. They need the ritual cycle. They need the offerings. The flood reveals that dependence because the gods themselves become hungry while humanity is drowning. Their authority may be higher, but their position is not independent. That point is easy to glide past. It should not be. If the Anunnaki require human labor and worship, then their relationship with humanity is reciprocal in a way later theology often tries to flatten. Not equal, certainly, not symmetrical, but reciprocal. Humans serve the gods. The gods, in turn, govern and protect the human order. Remove either side and strain appears in the system. No wonder then that Enlil and Enki become the central opposing figures in this archive of tension. Enlil represents authority, hierarchy, regulation, the need to preserve divine rest and enforce structure from above. Enki represents intervention, adaptation, preservation, tactical subversion, the refusal to let the system destroy what it also depends on. Their disagreement over humanity is not a minor quarrel. It is one of the foundational fractures of the post-flood age. And because the flood does not resolve that fracture later, conflicts unfold under its shadow. The post-flood world begins as compromise. Humans survive, but under limitation. Lifespan contracts. Fertility is constrained. Mortality is sharpened. The old world of immense rains and antediluvian scale is over. What follows is a diminished order, more regulated, more distant, more carefully managed. Yet the management itself carries suspicion within it because it was born from broken unity. An oath was taken. That oath was circumvented. The supreme authority's plan was not obeyed. The system continues, but trust has already thinned. When later tablets speak of cities assigned to particular divine patrons, of temples serving as residences of kings ruling under heavenly mandate, all of that must be read against this background. The structure exists. But beneath the structure lies remembered division. Enlil at Nippur, Enki at Eridu, separate centers, separate dispositions, separate visions of how humanity is to be handled. That is one reason the Sumerian materials often feel more like political archive than pure mythology. The gods do not simply embody abstract principles. They take positions. They disagree in council. They circumvent policy. They form blocks. They protect interests. They intervene through procedure rather than miracle alone. If one wanted to read this symbolically, one could say the texts are encoding ancient political realities in divine form. Certainly many scholars do. But even then, the texture of the account remains unusual. The details are too procedural to feel merely decorative. The compromises are too specific. The mechanisms matter too much. Enki does not simply save humanity in a broad moral gesture. He redirects worship to neutralize plague. He redirects worship again to neutralize drought. He uses a loophole in oath-taking to transmit instructions. He argues for population control rather than extermination. These are administrative responses, policy responses, governance responses. And Enlil, in turn, does not merely rage like a storm deity in the abstract. He complains of noise. He seeks reduction. He escalates from partial measures to comprehensive flood because partial measures have failed. He attempts to preserve divine order by stronger and stronger intervention. His logic is harsh, but it is also procedural. That is why the flood belongs in the same long continuum as the later wars. It is not separate from them. It is the first major revelation that the Anunnaki are not a seamless ruling unity. Their conflicts may not yet have become the full civil warfare named in the fragment, but the structure of civil conflict is already present. A divided council, competing centers of loyalty, disagreement over the management of subordinate populations, policy sabotage, compromise after near catastrophe. The post-flood world is not peace. It is tension contained, and tensions that are contained do not disappear. They circulate. They wait. They look for new forms. That is why the flood matters beyond its destruction. It created the world that followed, yes. But it also taught everyone within that world something dangerous. It taught them that decrees from the top could be resisted, that plans agreed in council could be undermined, that the supreme order itself was not beyond fracture. The old world had been erased. The new world was already compromised. And once such a lesson exists within a hierarchy, it does not remain isolated. Other figures see it. Other powers recognize it. If supreme authority can be evaded in the matter of humanity's survival, why not elsewhere? If formal structure conceals division, why not press against that division? If the world itself has already survived one great breach in divine unity, what prevents the next? The Atrahasis tradition never says these things openly. It does something quieter. It preserves the pattern and lets the pattern linger. Humans were created because the gods were divided. Humans survived because the gods were divided. The flood came because the gods were divided. The world after the flood continued under the rule of gods who remained divided. And in that divided world, later wars do not appear as sudden eruptions. They appear as consequences. Among the texts that preserve those consequences, Inanna and Ebi has a particularly sharp edge. It is often discussed as poetry, as liturgy, as political allegory. It is all of those things. But it is also, in its own plain way, a campaign account. The composition associated with Enheduanna, and preserved in copies housed in Chicago, describes a military confrontation between Inanna and Mount Ebi. The target is not simply a mountain, as geography. The text treats it as a defiant power, a territory that refuses submission, a place that does not acknowledge authority. That refusal is the spark. As Inanna moves through heaven and earth, through the lands associated with her sphere, Ebi does not bow. It does not offer recognition. It does not lower itself in proper respect. The offense is not random aggression. It is insubordination, a refusal to accept her claim. That matters because it places the conflict inside a political logic familiar from the other tablets. Disputes arise when an assigned order is challenged. Authority expects acknowledgement. The withholding of acknowledgement becomes rebellion. Rebellion invites response. Inanna, however, does not move immediately. She approaches, and the senior heavenly authority, and seeks support. His response is caution, warning, restraint. He tells her the mountain is formidable. The warriors there are dangerous. The campaign is not wise. The target is difficult and fearsome. This is one of the most revealing moments in the text. Because if the Anunnaki hierarchy were perfectly unified, warning from above would be enough. Senior authority would advise, and junior power would comply. But Inanna does not comply. She hears the counsel and proceeds anyway. She rejects caution. She determines to act. Again, the pattern returns. Formal hierarchy exists. Actual obedience is conditional. Inanna arms herself. And as so often in these texts, the description of her preparation is specific. She gathers the powers, or ordered capacities associated with divine office and operation. She fastens the 7 powers to her side. She prepares not in vague, heroic grandeur, but in deliberate sequence. Equipment is assembled, capability is gathered, strife is anticipated. Then the assault begins. The text describes firebrands, sustained flame, lightning used as directed force. The mountain is lit, inundated, broken. Livestock are destroyed. Trees are paralyzed. The land itself is rendered barren under the attack. The defenders fall. Warriors collapse. The population submits. Old women praise the conqueror. The mountain that refused respect finally offers it. This is not presented as a duel of abstractions. It is conquest. Military conquest followed by formal submission. Mainstream scholarship often reads the text politically as a literary reflection of Akkadian power reaching into mountain zones perhaps transformed through divine language. That reading has weight, but once again the text itself presents the action as Inanna's own campaign, not merely as metaphor for a human king's advance. And it presents the campaign inside the same broader world where divine figures hold territory, demand allegiance, receive submission, and wage war. What matters for our purposes is the pattern the text reinforces. First, territorial ambition exists among the Anunnaki. Inanna does not remain confined to symbolic function. She moves through space, asserts claims, and punishes refusal. Second, military force can be exercised without full senior authorization. She asks. She is warned against proceeding. She goes anyway. This is not orderly federation in calm balance. It is a system where powerful figures pursue their own agendas even when higher authority advises restraint. Third, the weapons and effects described resemble those found in other conflict traditions. Fire and lightning are not mere ornaments of divine grandeur. They are used with purpose. They devastate ecology as well as opponents. The land itself suffers. This continuity matters. Across tablets, divine warfare regularly produces effects beyond ordinary human battle. Landscapes are burned, populations are reduced, environments are altered. The descriptive habit is repeated too often to ignore. Fourth, the result of victory is not annihilation for its own sake. It is submission, recognition, reordering. The mountain now acknowledges Inanna's status. The issue at stake was legitimacy, not destruction alone. Force becomes the means by which political relationship is corrected. That makes the campaign especially significant. It is not a battle against chaos in the abstract. It is enforcement of sovereignty, or perhaps expansion of sovereignty. The line between the two may be the very thing under dispute. And that raises a larger question. If the post-flood order was supposed to channel authority from recognized centers, especially from Enlil's possession of the Tablet of Destinies and the council structure surrounding it, how much independent action were individual Anunnaki actually permitted? At what point does enforcement become usurpation? At what point does territorial assertion become challenge to the larger hierarchy? Inanna and Ebi never answers those questions directly. It doesn't need to. It simply lets the event stand. Inanna sought counsel. Counsel warned against war. Inanna armed herself. Inanna attacked. Inanna won. The result is a picture of a divine order that is not stable but competitive, not frozen but active, not internally peaceful but charged with unresolved assertion. Inanna is not the only figure in these texts to act with force, but hers is one of the clearest examples of autonomous initiative. An autonomous initiative is precisely what a fragile hierarchy fears most, because once one power sees that independence can succeed, others may follow. Once one territory is subdued by unilateral campaign, others learn what force can achieve. Once central caution is ignored without consequence, the formal structure weakens even if it remains outwardly intact. The mountain bowed in the end. But the deeper issue did not. What kind of order is this, where one divine figure can wage war, despite higher warning, can devastate a resisting land, and can emerge, not condemned, but confirmed through victory? It is not the order of simple mythic morality. It is not the calm order of unbroken hierarchy. It is the order of contested power. And the tablets keep preserving that same atmosphere from one composition to the next. A world in which authority is claimed, challenged, defended, and extended. A world in which the Anunnaki do not merely govern, they maneuver. Which means that by the time we arrive at the great succession battle of the Enuma Elish, the ground has already been prepared. We have already seen councils fail to maintain unity. We have seen theft nearly overturn legitimacy. We have seen creation survive because decrees were subverted. We have seen territorial campaigns carried out against advice. The next war will be larger than all of that. But it will not be alien to it. It will be the same pattern widened until it becomes cosmic. The Enuma Elish is often called a creation epic, and that is true, but it may be more accurate to say it is a war narrative whose aftermath becomes creation. The world that emerges from it is not first imagined in peace and then spoiled by conflict. It is formed through conflict after conflict from the remains of conflict. That distinction matters. The text opens before the ordered world as later ages know it. Fresh water and salt water mingle. From these depths come successive generations of divine beings. Younger gods arise. They multiply. They become active, noisy, difficult for their predecessors to endure. And here, almost uncannily, the language echoes the tension we heard in Atrahasis. The older power cannot rest. Disturbance rises from those below. Sleep is interrupted. Order feels threatened by the very life that has emerged within it. Apsu decides the younger generation must be destroyed. Tiamat initially resists. Division appears immediately, even at the highest and oldest level. Destruction is proposed. Destruction is contested. That rhythm again. Then Ea, identified with Enki in later equivalents, acts first. He does not wait for the threat to mature. He strikes preemptively. Apsu is subdued and killed. The younger generation secures itself by eliminating the elder before the elder can eliminate them. This matters because it means the cosmic order later celebrated in the text is born not from innocence, but from prior usurpation. The younger gods survive because they acted first. The old order is not superseded gently, it is broken. Tiamat then becomes the center of counter-mobilization. Grieving, enraged, and pressured by those displaced through Apsu's fall, she raises forces. The text catalogs them. Serpents, dragons, hybrid beings prepared for war. She appoints Kingu to command and gives him the tablet of destinies. Once more the object returns. Once more legitimacy and command are bound to possession. That repetition across traditions is one of the great anchors of continuity in the Mesopotamian archive. Enlil holds the tablet. Anzu steals it. Ninurta recovers it. Tiamat gives it to Kingu. Marduk later seizes it. This is not one isolated metaphor drifting through unrelated stories. It is a tracked center of authority, moving through remembered crises. The younger gods panic. Anu cannot face Tiamat. Others hesitate. Then Marduk steps forward, but not selflessly, not simply as savior. He offers his service on condition. If he is to fight, if he is to defeat Tiamat, then supreme authority must be granted to him permanently. He wants more than battlefield command. He wants constitutional transformation. That demand reveals the true scale of the war. This is not merely survival, it is succession. The assembly agrees. Marduk is invested with the authority to determine destiny through speech. The wording is formal. The transfer is not casual. A new center of power is being authorized before the battle even begins. Victory will confirm what council has already provisionally granted. Then comes the confrontation itself. Marduk's preparation is described with the same technical density we have seen elsewhere. Bow, club, lightning, net. Winds created specifically for combat. Storm chariot. Supernatural horses. The inventory is precise because effect matters. Deployment matters, means matter. The text wants us to understand not simply that Marduk is mighty, but how his might is arranged. Tiamat opens her mouth. Marduk sends the winds inside, forcing her open, swelling her from within, so that the decisive shot can follow. Arrow enters. Heart is pierced. She falls. And then the text does something unforgettable. It does not merely say the enemy is defeated, it says the enemy is processed. Split in two. One half becomes the sky. One half becomes the earth. Mountains, rivers, clouds, the visible world itself emerge from the disassembly of a conquered body. Modern readers often instinctively treat this as pure mythic imagination. Perhaps it is. But even within its imaginative frame, the narrative remains strikingly procedural. Marduk is not improvising cosmic poetry. He is reorganizing material. The world is constructed from available substance after victory. Creation is engineering after war. Then Kingu is seized. The tablet of destinies is taken from him. Marduk returns with proof of victory and possession. The assembly confirms him. Babylon becomes the new center. Marduk receives names and functions that absorb older powers into his own office. Authority once distributed is consolidated. This is the deepest consequence of the text. Not simply that Marduk wins, but that the war permanently restructures the hierarchy. Before, authority was layered and distributed among older centers. After, Babylon and Marduk stand above. The geography of divine order shifts. The constitutional map changes. That is why mainstream scholarship reads the text as Babylonian political theology. It absolutely serves that purpose. It justifies Babylon's rise by projecting its patron god into cosmic supremacy. It rewrites hierarchy in theological terms to match political ambition in historical Mesopotamia. All of that is persuasive. And yet, even while recognizing that function, one has to admit that the narrative still participates in the larger continuity of conflict we have been tracing. It is another war among divine beings. Another dispute over authority. Another crisis in which the tablet of destinies determines legitimacy. Another instance where formal order is not inherited peacefully, but remade by force. The old world does not simply evolve into the new, it is overthrown. That makes the Enuma Elish different in scale from Anzu's coup or Inanna's mountain war, but not different in kind. It belongs to the same archive of contest, the same world where hierarchy is repeatedly challenged, the same world where power depends on objects, councils, decrees, and decisive violence. The same world where victory does not restore a neutral order, but establishes a new one. And that is precisely why the text matters in the broader pattern. It proves that among the Anunnaki conflict can do more than destabilize. It can permanently reorder the cosmos. If Anzu's theft revealed fragility, Marduk's victory demonstrated replaceability. If the flood exposed division, this war institutionalized a new center built from division's outcome. What had been held in one place can be moved. What had been held by one generation can be seized by another. What had been called cosmic order can be rewritten. The implication is as quiet as it is immense. Among the Anunnaki war is not an interruption of order. War is one of the ways order changes. By the time we reach the city, laments the scale shifts again. The focus is no longer the internal drama of divine succession alone, nor the theft of authority, nor the campaign of one divine power against a defiant territory. Now the record turns toward cities, toward human communities, toward streets, walls, temples, and the populations caught beneath decisions made elsewhere. The lament over the destruction of Ur is one of the clearest examples. Reconstructed from multiple fragments, much of it from Nippur, the composition describes the fall of the great city at the end of the Third Dynasty. Historically, modern scholarship associates that collapse with invasion, political strain, and regional upheaval around 2000 BCE. The text, however, frames the destruction differently. Human armies are present, yes, but they are not primary. The first cause is divine decision. Enlil decrees destruction. A storm is called. Protective gods withdraw. The city becomes vulnerable. Then devastation comes. Again, the order of events matters. The city does not simply fall because enemies are strong. It falls because divine protection has been lifted and destructive force has been authorized. Human assault follows what the lament treats as a prior and more fundamental abandonment. The storm in these texts is especially important. It is not described like ordinary weather. It does not behave like a passing atmospheric event. It is summoned, directed, purposed. It levels structures, ruins fields, and covers the city like a sheet. The wording may be poetic, yes, but the consistency is notable. The storm is an instrument, a weapon, a method of obliteration issued from higher command. Ningal pleads. She approaches the great powers. She weeps before them. She asks that Ur be spared. No answer comes. The protective deities associated with the city depart. Nana abandons his dwelling. The residents remain below, while the powers above withdraw. This pattern appears across multiple city laments: divine departure, first catastrophe, second. Presence leaves destruction enters. That sequence has enormous meaning within the Mesopotamian worldview. A city is not only walls and labor and grain stores. A city is also the residence of its patron power. Remove that power, and the city is no longer merely militarily exposed. It is ontologically unguarded. Its right to continuity has been suspended. The lament dwells on consequences. Bodies in streets, blood in marketplaces, children lost, women violated, temples defiled, fields rendered barren, water systems broken. The city ceases to function as city. Yet the text insists the people of Ur were not destroyed because they were uniquely wicked. That is another point worth holding on to. The composition does not primarily moralize. It does not say this happened because the population deserved it in a simple ethical sense. It says this happened because destruction was decreed. That makes the event political at a higher level. Decision precedes punishment. Authority chooses to unmake what it had once allowed to flourish. Why the text does not fully explain. It gestures toward ominous causes, toward evil in the city, toward portents of destruction. Later interpretation often suggests that human rulers had exceeded proper limits, that centralized kingship had become too grand, perhaps too close to divine prerogative, and that the city's destruction restored a more acceptable balance between human and divine power. That is plausible. It also fits the broader pattern. When human political structures grow too consolidated, the tablets often remember destruction following. Ur then becomes more than one city's tragedy. It becomes another example of a recurring principle. Human power is tolerated only within limits set above. Cities may flourish, dynasties may rise, kings may unify regions. But if political concentration threatens the structure of divine oversight, the structure can be broken. And the laments preserve that breaking in slow detail. It is tempting to call these compositions purely theological trauma processing, and surely they are partly that. People suffering catastrophe seek explanation. They frame loss within sacred language. They make meaning. Yet even if we grant all of that, the recurring logic across city laments remains striking. Destruction is not random. It is authorized. The powers above debate or decide. Protective presence is withdrawn. Weaponized devastation follows. Human enemies enter afterward or alongside it. That is not a single imaginative flourish. It is a pattern. The destruction of also matters because of what it changes. The Third Dynasty had represented a powerful centralization of authority across much of Mesopotamia. Its fall returns the landscape to fragmentation. City-states re-emerge. Regional competition resumes. No single human center maintains equivalent dominance for long in the same way. Whether one reads that as theological narrative or remembered politics in divine dress, the effect is the same. Concentration is broken. Plurality returns local. Divine patronage matters once more. This outcome serves the larger order described in the tablets. A landscape of separate cities, each tied to its own patron deity, each dependent on particular sacred centers, is easier to supervise than a unified human political structure growing too strong. Fragmentation from that perspective is not failure. It is management. And so the lament ends not in absolute finality, but in partial renewal. The city may be rebuilt. The god may return. Ritual may resume. Yet the former supremacy does not fully come back. Something has been corrected. Something has been limited. The destruction has done its work. What work? The same work these tablets repeatedly describe. Preserving hierarchy, punishing overreach, reasserting dependence, reminding cities that their flourishing is conditional. Once again, the pattern is not random violence. It is structured violence. Violence issuing from decision. Violence aimed at political and cosmic realignment. And once you begin to place beside the flood, beside Anzu's theft, beside Inanna's campaign, beside Marduk's victory, the pattern grows sharper. Different scale, different target, same underlying atmosphere. Order is not stable. Authority is conditional. Conflict restructures. Destruction is a tool. The human world below does not stand apart from divine conflict. It absorbs the consequences. It is where consequences become visible. Cities burn where councils decide. Fields die where hierarchies fracture. Populations are reduced where legitimacy is contested. If the earlier tablets show the Anunnaki disputing among themselves, the city laments show what that means for everyone living under them. And what it means again and again is that when higher order shifts, the ground below pays. If we step back now, if we let the tablets sit side by side, instead of reading them one at a time, certain patterns begin to repeat with such steadiness that they are difficult to ignore. The first is simple, though not small. Conflict usually begins when established authority is challenged. Anzu challenges Enlil by stealing the Tablet of Destinies. The Igigi challenge the labor hierarchy by rebellion. Tiamat challenges the younger generation after Apsu's death. Inanna moves against Ebi because it does not acknowledge her authority. Human cities are destroyed when their order no longer fits what the higher order permits. Again and again, the initiating problem is not chaos in the abstract. It is insubordination, rejection, refusal contest over rightful place. That matters because it means the world of these tablets is not governed by broad moral dualism. It is governed by structure. The great question is not merely good versus evil. It is legitimacy. Who may rule? Who may decide? Who may hold what office, what territory, what object, what degree of command? The second pattern follows from the first. Authority is repeatedly tied to specific objects, procedures, and sites. The Tablet of Destinies is the clearest example. It appears across narratives not as a metaphor one time and a different metaphor the next, but as a tracked center of command. Whoever holds it can ratify decrees. Whoever loses it loses effective control. Anzu nearly overturns the entire hierarchy through theft. Kingu is elevated through possession. Marduk confirms supremacy by seizing it. The object is not ornamental, it is constitutional. That has strange implications. It suggests the Anunnaki are not simply limitless beings whose authority resides naturally and permanently in themselves. They operate inside a system. Their positions depend on mechanisms. Their power, however great, is formalized and mediated. Remove the object, interrupt the mechanism, and the order falters. The third pattern is council. Again and again, major decisions are made in assembly. The flood requires consensus and oath. Anzu's theft leads to deliberation about response. Tiamat's challenge leads to an assembled transfer of authority to Marduk. Senior figures argue, plans are proposed, support is sought. This is not a world of simple divine monarchy. Even when one figure appears supreme, the structure still requires consultation, agreement, ratification. That is politically revealing. It makes the hierarchy feel less like undivided empire and more like uneasy federation. The fourth pattern is tactical specificity in warfare. Weapons are cataloged, effects are described. Sharur scouts and reports. Arrows are nullified by command. Winds are created for combat. Firebrands devastate mountain lands. Plague is deployed through divine agents. Storm is summoned as destructive instrument against cities. These accounts do not merely say that divine beings are powerful. They describe means sequence and operational effect. This is one of the reasons the texts continue to unsettle modern readers. Pure myth often dwells in image and significance. These materials often dwell in process. Things are done in particular ways. Battles are won not by vague superiority alone, but by tactics positioning loopholes, counsel, and targeting. The fifth pattern is environmental consequence. Divine conflict does not remain confined to the combatants. Landscapes are burned, livestock die, trees are ruined, cities are leveled, fields become barren, waters rise. The scale exceeds ordinary human warfare, at least as the texts describe it. Whether one reads that as literary magnification, supernatural force, or memory of something more difficult to classify, the result is consistent. When the Anunnaki contend, the world below is altered. The sixth pattern concerns humanity itself. Humans are never entirely outside these struggles, yet they are rarely the primary decision makers within them. Humanity is labor force, ritual, partner-dependent population, sometimes beneficiary, sometimes target, often instrument. Enlil wants reduction. Enki wants preservation. Cities flourish under patronage and collapse when patronage is withdrawn. Human kings rule, but their kingship descends from elsewhere. Human society matters enormously but usually as part of a larger arrangement governed above. The seventh pattern is restructuring. These conflicts do not usually end by returning the world neatly to what it was before. The flood creates a new human condition. Marduk's victory creates a new cosmic hierarchy. Ur's destruction breaks a human political order and restores a different balance. Even Anzu's failed coup leaves behind knowledge of systemic vulnerability. Conflict changes the shape of the world. The eighth pattern is continuity across sources. Later texts assume earlier events. Ninurta's victory over Anzu becomes a known accomplishment. The Tablet of Destinies retains history as it moves from holder to holder. Pre-flood and post-flood periods are treated as parts of one chronology. This continuity is one of the strongest reasons the corpus feels less like disconnected myth and more like archive. Different compositions do not merely rhyme thematically, they refer. And then comes the ninth pattern, which belongs not to the ancient tablets, but to us. Modern scholarship, almost by necessity, reads these materials as mythological, theological, political, symbolic. That reading is disciplined, it is careful, it explains much, it guards against credulity, yet the 10th pattern remains, and it belongs to the tablets themselves. The texts present their material as though it were documentation. They are copied like records, they are framed like history, they preserve procedural details, they maintain chronologies, they track objects, names, places, outcomes. This does not prove literality. It does not force one interpretation, but it does create tension. The scribes do not write as though they are preserving transparent fiction. They write as though they are maintaining memory. And that tension may be the most important thing the tablets leave us with. Because if these are myths, they are myths maintained with documentary seriousness. If these are histories, they are histories of beings modern categories do not comfortably admit. If they are a blend of historical experience and theological framing, then the blend is so deep that separation becomes difficult without imposing our own assumptions onto the archive. The tablets do not resolve this for us. They simply repeat themselves in their own calm way. Conflict among the Anunnaki, reordered hierarchy, cities destroyed, humanity preserved, reduced, governed, exposed, objects of power stolen and recovered, councils convened, outcomes recorded. At some point, repetition itself becomes evidence of intention, not proof of what happened, but proof that those who preserved these materials thought something had happened and thought it mattered enough to remember carefully. That is where the archive becomes most difficult to dismiss, because one isolated story can be called imagination. But a sustained tradition of interconnected accounts copied across centuries using the same names and the same centers of power and the same objects of legitimacy begins to feel like something else. Not certainty, not solved mystery, but something denser than casual myth-making. A system of memory, a discipline of transmission, a world the scribes believed had once been real enough to record. And so we return, almost inevitably, to the silence of museum storage, to shelves, to drawers, to climate control, to fragments labeled and cataloged, to clay preserved because someone at every stage of its long passage decided that what it contained was worth keeping. It matters that these tablets survived the way they did. Not just buried, but copied before burial. Not just copied, but recopied. Not just recopied, but distributed, across cities and centuries. Scribes in different times inherited these materials and chose not to let them vanish. That choice, repeated over generations, tells us something about value. These texts were not incidental. They were not regarded as disposable stories. Which brings us back to the central uncertainty. What were they preserving? There are, broadly speaking, three possible readings. The first is the most literal and the most difficult for modern thought, that the ancient Mesopotamians were recording actual events involving beings with extraordinary capabilities, beings they called Anunnaki, whose conflicts shaped the earliest structures of civilization. The second is that they created elaborate mythology, which they themselves believed to be historical. The third is that they preserved memory of human events, political collapses, invasions, dynastic struggles, environmental disasters, but framed those events through divine language so thoroughly that gods became the visible actors in the story. All three possibilities explain something. None explains everything. The first explains the archival seriousness, the continuity, the procedural density. But it demands acceptance of beings and capacities for which modern archaeology offers no direct confirmation. The second explains the supernatural features and the strong religious character of the texts. But it asks us to believe that generations of sophisticated record keepers maintained vast mythic continuity with the same documentary tone they used for practical archives. The third explains why events in the texts often correspond loosely to historical destructions and political change, but it risks assuming too easily that ancient people could not distinguish between divine and human causation, that they necessarily translated all major events into sacred narrative because they had no other framework. Perhaps they did, perhaps they did not. The tablets do not settle the matter. What they do settle, at least as far as intention is concerned, is that the Sumerians and their successors treated these matters as serious knowledge. They preserved them beside king lists, legal materials, astronomical texts, ritual instructions, and administrative accounts. They cross-referenced them, they embedded them in chronology, they copied them carefully. That is not a small point. We are often tempted to think ancient people were casual in areas where we would be skeptical. Yet the same cultures that preserved these accounts also gave us writing law, mathematics, bureaucracy, astronomy of remarkable precision, and urban administration of formidable complexity. These were not unserious minds. They were disciplined observers of the world they inhabited. If they wrote in documentary tones about divine conflicts, then at the very least they believed such conflicts belonged inside the category of recordable reality. That does not mean they were right, but it does mean they were not carelessly inventing in the way modern dismissal sometimes implies. Maybe the deepest question is not whether the Anunnaki existed in some modern literalized sense. Maybe the deeper question is what kind of relationship ancient Mesopotamians had to whatever they called by that name. Were these deified memories of rulers? Were they non-human intelligences, as the texts straightforwardly imply? Were they powers of governance and cosmos expressed in language that did not separate sacred from historical, the way modern categories do? The archive leaves all of those doors slightly open, and perhaps that is why the line on the broken fragment still feels so strong. When the Anunnaki made war upon the Anunnaki. The statement is too plain to dismiss comfortably, and too strange to absorb without remainder. It sits in that narrow space where interpretation becomes unavoidable and certainty becomes impossible. The phrase does not say, "It is said that." It does not say, "The poets imagine." It does not say, as in ritual. It says, "War happened. Here are the parties." The Anunnaki against themselves. Everything we have examined circles back to that kind of claim. Not simply that divine powers exist, not simply that gods shape weather or fertility, but that they contend among themselves over succession authority, territory, and policy. That their internal conflicts matter, that those conflicts can reorder the world. If one reads the archive conventionally, then what one sees is an extraordinary civilization processing political and environmental trauma through a coherent, sacred language. That is meaningful. If one reads it less conventionally, then one sees records of a hierarchy older than humanity, one that governed, fractured, and fought, leaving only texts as trace. That too is meaningful, if harder to hold. Either way, the clay remains where it remains. The museums preserve what they can. Scholars translate and compare. Readers listen decades and continents away. The tablets do not shout. They endure. And perhaps endurance is part of their force. They have waited long enough that our categories feel younger than they do. History, myth, memory, theology, political chronicle. All of those words try to close the gap. None closes it completely. So perhaps the most honest posture, at least for now, is not final belief and not final dismissal, but sustained attention. To keep reading the tablets as they ask to be read. Slowly, carefully, without reducing their strangeness too quickly, without pretending uncertainty is failure. Because uncertainty may be precisely what the archive leaves us when the evidence is too textured for one answer and too persistent for easy neglect. The clay preserves the claim. The modern mind supplies the categories. The distance between them remains. And maybe that distance is the true subject now. There is one more feature of these texts that deserves a slower look, because once noticed, it changes the atmosphere of everything else. It is their restraint. The Sumerian and Akkadian materials do not usually present these immense events with the emotional excess we often expect from myth. The flood destroys a world, and the king list says only that the flood swept over. Anzu's theft suspends cosmic order, and the epic quickly turns to sequence, response, tactic, and recovery. Humanity is created from clay and divine blood, and the account reads almost like procedure. Cities are destroyed, and the laments, though full of grief, still preserve administrative logic in the background decree withdrawal storm aftermath. This bureaucratic calm is not incidental. It tells us something about scribal habit, about the way memory was shaped in writing. The scribe is not there to exclaim. The scribe is there to preserve. The result is a tone that feels closer to archival record than to ecstatic tale. Even when the events described exceed ordinary possibility, the language often remains matter of fact. That is one reason the tablets continue to trouble modern assumptions. We know how to classify stories that sound like stories. We know how to classify political records that sound like records. But what do we do with records that sound like records while speaking of things we think cannot have happened? The usual answer is that ancient people did not separate myth and history as we do. That is likely true, at least in part. But even granting that, the question remains, why this tone? Why this procedural steadiness? Why this constant cross-referential care? When they recorded grain, they meant grain. When they recorded contracts, they meant contracts. When they recorded celestial motions, they meant celestial motions. So when they recorded wars among the Anunnaki in the same controlled style, what did they think they meant? Intent is not the same as truth. One can sincerely record error. One can preserve mistaken memory with great care. But sincerity matters especially in a civilization so committed to writing as preservation. The archive suggests not casual storytelling, but disciplined transmission. And that returns us to an uncomfortable possibility. Modern thought prefers not to linger over too long, that the Sumerians may have believed they were documenting the affairs of real governing powers, whether those powers were what we would call divine, non-human, deified, or something else for which our language remains poor. Of course, skepticism remains warranted. No direct archaeological layer announces the physical presence of beings matching these descriptions. We do not uncover a clear machine and label it the Tablet of Destinies. We do not excavate a battlefield and identify the bones of Tiamat's monsters. Material culture does not confirm the narratives in any straightforward way. Yet material culture does confirm cities. It confirms destruction. It confirms rebuilding. It confirms the administrative sophistication of the societies preserving these claims. And perhaps that is why the issue does not settle cleanly. Because the archive lives in a difficult middle place, too specific to dismiss as random fantasy, too extraordinary to accept without reserve, too coherent to ignore, too strange to simplify. Some scholars resolve that tension by emphasizing political theology. Babylon rose, therefore Marduk rose in narrative. Cities fell, therefore gods were said to have withdrawn. Floods occurred, therefore flood stories expanded. This approach is rigorous and often persuasive, but it still leaves something unexplained: the density of procedural detail and continuity in the tradition. Why preserve the movements of objects, like the Tablet of Destinies, across separate compositions? Why keep naming the same actors in the same relative offices? Why track the structure of authority so carefully if all of this is only diffuse symbolic language? Perhaps because symbols matter. Perhaps because theological systems require consistency. That is possible. Ancient priesthoods could maintain astonishing continuity, but perhaps also because the writers were not merely preserving symbol. Perhaps they were preserving what they believed had happened. The difference between those possibilities is subtle, but profound. If the texts are symbolic first, then their continuity reflects doctrinal maintenance. If the texts are historical in intention, then their continuity reflects memory management. Both demand serious scribes. Both fit some of the evidence. Neither dissolves the mystery entirely, and so the archive continues to resist us in the same way the fragment resists us. It says too much and not enough. Too much for dismissal, not enough for certainty. That may be why people keep returning to these tablets generation after generation, even after scholarship has established its sensible frameworks. Something remains unresolved in them. Something in the clay feels less dead than categories should make it feel. These are not merely artifacts of belief. They are artifacts of sustained concern. Their preservers wanted them to last. And they have lasted. They have lasted through the collapse of cities that wrote them, through the burial of libraries, through excavation, through empire, through translation, through skepticism, through fascination. Now they sit in quiet storage and museum halls, still saying the same thing in the same tone they said it the first time this happened. This followed. This was decided. This was lost. This was restored. This power moved. This city fell. These beings contended. History may say no. Mythology may say yes, but symbolically. The tablets themselves say only what they say, and perhaps that is why they remain so difficult to leave behind once one has listened closely enough. So now at the end of all this, we arrive where the tablets leave us not with a final answer, but with a silence full of carefully preserved claims. The pre-flood cities, the impossible rains, the flood that swept over, the rebuilt order, the split between Enlil and Enki, the theft of the Tablet of Destinies, the mountain that refused to bow, the succession war that remade cosmic authority, the cities abandoned by their gods and given over to storm. Again and again, the archive returns to the same underlying reality. The Anunnaki, whatever they were, did not remain in perfect unity. They disputed, they challenged, they resisted, they overthrew, they punished, they reorganized. They made war upon one another. And what makes that phrase linger is not simply its strangeness, it is its calm. The line is not trying to persuade. It is not decorated into grandeur. It does not ask us to feel awe before it. It simply states, that is what the clay does best. It receives pressure. It holds marks. It waits. Perhaps that is why these tablets feel different from many later traditions. They do not strain toward revelation in the dramatic sense. They do not insist that we believe. They just remain. A record exists. A phrase survives. A pattern can be traced. The rest is left to the reader, the listener, the generation encountering the archive after thousands of years. If one chooses the conventional view, the tablets become a remarkable testimony to how ancient Mesopotamians understood power, catastrophe, kingship, legitimacy, and the vulnerability of order. They become mythology with unusual administrative density, sacred narrative that thinks like bureaucracy, theology, shaped by people who lived inside cities, archives, and systems. That is already fascinating. If one chooses the less conventional view, the tablets become something stranger still, surviving records of non-human or more than human authorities whose internal conflicts shaped the earliest remembered civilizations. That is harder to accept, harder to prove, harder to fit anywhere stable. But the texts do at least leave the possibility open enough that the question refuses to disappear entirely. And maybe that is the most honest place to rest, not in certainty, but in the endurance of the question. What did the Sumerians think they were recording? What kind of beings did they mean when they wrote Anunnaki? What relationship did they believe existed between their cities and those powers? Why did they preserve these conflicts with the same care they gave to law, ritual, trade, and kingship? Why does the archive sound less like fantasy than our categories would prefer? The clay does not answer. It preserves. Somewhere tonight, perhaps in Baghdad, perhaps in London, perhaps in Philadelphia, or Paris, or Oxford, or Chicago, fragments of these old records sit in darkness, designed to keep them from changing any further. Stable temperature, controlled humidity, shelves, drawers, labels, accession numbers. Modern institutions doing for these tablets what ancient scribes once did in another form, protecting them from loss. And still the old words travel, from temple archive to buried ruin, from buried ruin to excavation crate, from crate to museum collection, from collection to transliteration, from translation to your ears. when the Anunnaki made war upon the Anunnaki. The line remains direct. The evidence remains complicated. The interpretation remains open. And perhaps that openness is not a weakness in the material, but part of its power. We live at a distance from the world that produced these texts. Our categories are not their categories. Our assumptions are not their assumptions. We inherit fragments, not total context. We reconstruct. We compare. We argue. We remain uncertain. But uncertainty is not the same as emptiness. Sometimes uncertainty is what remains when evidence has survived, but certainty has not. The Sumerians may have been preserving mythology. They may have been preserving distorted memory. They may have been preserving history in a form we no longer know how to read cleanly. Whatever the case, they preserved it because they believed it mattered. That may be the one conclusion the tablets themselves permit without much resistance. These accounts were important enough to copy, important enough to organize, important enough to transmit across centuries, important enough that even now broken clay can still trouble the modern mind. So, as this comes to rest, the question remains where it began, not what we can prove absolutely, but what the archive insists on saying. That there were cities before the flood, that kingship descended from heaven, that humanity lived under powers older than itself, that those powers did not remain at peace, that war came among them, that the consequences of those conflicts reached Earth City, King Field, and Temple, that scribes wrote this down, that others copied it, that the clay endured, and now the burden passes to us, as it always does with old records. Not the burden of forced belief and not the comfort of effortless dismissal, but the burden of interpretation. To sit with what has survived. To hear the claim without rushing to close it. To admit what is known, what is guessed, what remains unresolved. Wherever you are now, whatever hour has settled around you, those ancient words have reached you again tonight. Pressed into wet clay long ago, hardened, buried, found, read, preserved, spoken once more. The tablets say it happened. What that means and what kind of truth they carry is a question left in your hands now. And perhaps that finally is the most fitting ending of all. Not certainty, not closure, just the clay, the silence around it, and the old unresolved line still waiting inside the dark when the Anunnaki made war upon the Anunnaki.